so we're now on our fourth and final type of market. We talked about perfect competition, monopolies, monopolistic competition, and now oligopolies. Okay? An oligopoly is a market with a few producers. All right? When I say few, it's kind of hard to say what exactly that number is. You might have just two firms, so it's called a duopoly. That fits into the characteristics of oligopoly really well. Maybe having 6 or 7 firms could still be oligopoly, but at some point there becomes many firms, and at that point this isn't really a practical way to think about things. So oligopoly is a scenario where there are a few firms, and as a result, the firms are closely competitive with one another. Okay, and this is unique in the sense that in all the other categories we've talked about, all the other types of markets, they haven't really been in direct competition. So if you think about monopolies, there is no other competitor. In perfect competition, there are so many firms you don't even really care about the other firms. In monopolistic competition, you're producing something slightly unique. So you don't so much care about what the other firms are doing. So if you are Olive Garden, you don't really care about what Wendy's is doing per se. You care about all of your competitors, but not each individual competitor. However, in oligopolies, if there's only, say, 3 firms in the market, you really care about what those other 2 firms are doing. You're in direct competition with them. So what they choose to do will directly influence you. Okay, and that's the key characteristic of oligopoly. So here are the things to know about oligopolies. Few sellers, all right, as we said before. And usually many buyers, so there's still lots of consumers for these products, but there's only a few sellers. The reasons for the few sellers part of this, well, there could be lots of reasons why this is happening. One, there could be laws giving some people specific access to a resource perhaps. It may be that the city of Atlanta has decided we're just going to only allow 2 power producers in the city. Well, then you'd have an oligopoly with 2 producers. So there could be laws that make this happen. There could be economies of scale. If you recall, this means that as production goes up, average total cost goes down. So there could be economies of scale, and what that means is as firms get bigger, they get cheaper. Okay? And rarely do economies of scale always exist. What I mean by that is firms usually get so big that eventually their average costs start to go up. This is something we talked way back about in chapter 22, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it does turn out that this is a really important one. So for example, if you've wondered why Home Depot and Lowe's have such a major share of the market for this, construction equipment and so forth, it's probably because of the economies of scale. If you're just one business, it's really hard to produce a lot of different items. So if I just want to start my own hardware store, a huge hardware store, the upfront costs are going to be really high. But if I have a bunch of stores, adding one more is usually pretty easy. So it turns out that there are economies of scale up to some point, okay? And that leads this market to have only 2 major competitors. And we might call that oligopolies, okay? You can see it's not really a perfect oligopoly because there are other hardware stores, but it's like they have an oligopoly for big box hardware stores. And that's usually what you'll see with these types of things is rarely there's a perfect definition of oligopolies. Rarely there's a perfect definition of any of these types of markets, but it gets awfully close, okay? So you may have economies of scale, you may have laws, you may just have a small market. And so in this case, it's not really so much an economic reason, it may just be a population reason, okay? So if you're in a small town that only has 3 gas stations, that would be oligopoly. It's not because there's barriers to entry or economies of scale or anything, it's just that there aren't that many consumers, so there can only be 3 gas stations. And you've probably seen this before. If there are 3 gas stations in a small town, those gas stations are going to be very competitive with one another. You'll sometimes see price wars where they're trying to undercut each other in terms of gas prices. That's what oligopoly looks like. Direct competition with one another. And then lastly here, just one more. Maybe there's access to a key resource. Not a perfect example, but right now you might think about oil. There's only so many countries that have oil, and they end up operating similar to oligopolies where they're in direct competition with one another. So the access to the key resource, it could be access to a resource like oil or some sort of rubies or something like that, some type of mineral, or it could be access to something like an Atlanta State Farm Arena. There's only so many different types of sporting events and so forth that are allowed to be held there. So there's access to a resource that other people can't use. So there's some of the reasons why there might be only a few sellers. And that, number one, is the key difference between oligopolies and other markets. In terms of the item, the firms could sell identical or slightly differentiated products. So small town gas stations are going to sell slightly differentiated products. They're not going to look exactly the same. One might have cleaner bathrooms, one might have better pumps, one might have a cover over their pumps, the other one doesn't. These are all things that customers care about. When you're selling gas, it's not just about the gas, it's about the experience, the cleanliness, and so forth. So those products would be slightly different. In other markets, they might be selling the same thing. So for example, in oil, which we sometimes consider an oligopoly, oil is oil. It doesn't really matter whose oil it is, the quality is the same. So it's not so much about the types of products, it's just that there are a few producers in the market. And then the third thing to recognize is that the barriers to entry are usually significant. So there's usually some reason why there are just a few firms. It might be high startup costs. It might be that there are economies of scale which make it too hard to penetrate that market. Or it may simply be that there are rules or laws that stop me from being able to enter the market. But usually there's some reason this is happening. The only time that this is not the case is when there are simply just not that many consumers, where you're selling a niche good that not that many people want, or you're physically located in an area with small populations. All right? So these are the types of things we would expect to see for oligopolies. And let's get back to that example that I just discussed. A couple of gas stations in a small town. And let's just think about two. So let's imagine there are two gas stations in a small town, and let's just assume that gas prices are really important to them. First of all, you could recognize why this would be an oligopoly and what this would mean. All right? If you're running one of these gas stations, you care so much about what the other gas station is doing. If the other gas station lowers its prices, what do you have to do? You got to lower your price too, right? And if they raise their prices, well, then that gives you the ability to raise your price if you want. So you're going to really think about what the other firm is doing. If the other firm suddenly has a lot cleaner bathrooms, you might have to keep your bathrooms cleaner too, okay? So basically, what you might realize here is that the competitive nature here is going to be actually pretty complex, okay? Let's say that average gas prices for the U.S. are, $1.99. Okay? Well, then what do you think is going to happen to these two individual firms? Let's think about scenario one, which is full competition. So you've got these two gas stores, all right? So put G1 and G2 for these two stores. And let's imagine that right now this is what they're charging. Let's assume these two gas stations are right across the street from one another. As a consumer, if you need to buy gas, which one are you going to go to? All right? You're going to go to the cheaper one. So what's the first one going to do? They're going to drop their prices too. And they drop it to $2.25. If you're the second gas station now, think about what's going to happen to your customer base. It's about to dry up. Customers really care about the price of gasoline, and if you're not getting those customers, you can't make a profit. So what do? You drop your price down as well. And eventually you can kind of imagine what occurs is their prices end up corresponding closely to what's happening in the market. And what do you think their profits are looking like? Because they're competing so extremely with one another, the economic profits will approach zero. They get to a point where if they dropped them any further, they would have to go out of business. They would be losing money. So they're going to drop their prices until they get to a point where they reach what would be a perfectly competitive price. Okay? You can see that if they compete, they end up with an outcome that the producers don't like, but the consumers would like. And I don't know if you've seen this before, but I have. I've gone through small towns quite a bit, and it's sometimes surprising you'll see very cheap gas prices. I've seen gas prices actually go below sort of the typical average. I used to live in Mississippi, and there were these two gas stations that were really famous for this. Their prices were about 20 cents cheaper than anyone else because they basically got so competitive that they undercut themselves to a point where their profits went to zero. It can happen, all right? It is a very feasible thing to occur. But now let's think about a second scenario. Imagine it's you and me that run these gas stations. I run G1 and you run G2. What could we do? Well, we might say, you know what, meet out behind the gas station. I want to talk to you. All right? You come up to me and you're like, what do you want to do? And I'm like, well, here's the deal. Are you making a lot of profit? And you're like, no, I'm not making much profit. I'm charging $1.99. This is not working. All right, here's what we do. Why don't we just both agree to charge $3 a gallon? All right, these customers, they're still going to buy from us because we're the only businesses in town. Let's set our prices at $3 and let's just agree to do that for as long as we possibly can. All right, deal? Deal. So the outcome here is they both set their prices at $3, and because they're the only producers in town, they're only going to lose a little bit of consumption. You know, some consumers may choose not to buy at these gas stations, but they've effectively converted their oligopoly into a monopoly. It's kind of like now they formed a collusion to act as if they are just one company. Here they're acting like they're very competitive, but here it's like they're pretending they're one business. We're both selling gas, we'll just charge one price for it. And so now the economic profits can be positive because these firms operate like a monopoly. What do monopolies do? Relative to perfectly competitive firms, what do monopolies do? They raise the price and they reduce their quantity, right? They become price searchers. And these firms are now acting as if they are price searchers. I bet you've seen this before, right? I bet you have. I bet you've seen a couple of gas stations that have really high prices in a small town. It's probably because they've been talking to one another. Back when I lived in Mississippi, I used to host trivia at a bar, and I talked to the bar owner there a lot, and he said, me and the other bar owners have agreed that we're not going to do happy hours on the same day, that we're going to mix it up. They basically met and figured out a way to collude on prices a bit. This is sometimes referred to as a cartel, and this is when a group of businesses collude to set prices higher than they would be competitive. So it's interesting when you look at these firms, a lot of times they end up operating very close to perfectly competitive outcomes, or they end up operating when they're very close to monopolies. Okay? What will determine that is, do they get along? Do they trust each other? You can imagine if they hate each other, this scenario is probably not going to happen, right? Me and you meet behind a gas station, you hate me, I say we're going to set prices at $3, the next day I wake up and look out there and you're charging $2.50, right? You've undercut my prices and now we'll end up competing again. So it really depends on the outcome. It also depends on how many firms there are. The more firms there are, the harder it is to collude. If there are 2 gas stations, pretty easy to get together and talk about prices, but if there are many, it's going to be tough. In the U.S., this type of activity is illegal, and there are businesses that get busted up for doing these types of things all the time. Getting together and setting prices is truly against the law. So if you know this is happening, in some scenarios you can actually sue the firms and get them to basically break them up and make them competitive again. All right, in the next video we're going to talk about game theory, which will think about these sort of choices in a more mathematical way.